Hi, and welcome back to Continual Fandom. It's time for Red Alert. Get those shields up, power up the phasers, and get the photon cannons ready because we have brought in a bunch of nerds to talk about Star Trek.
You
I'm
meant
your host, Jim
photon
Nettles.
torpedoes.
Yeah, well, I know, but I'm here to cause mischief, mayhem. I'm putting on my Loki horns before we admit he's a Q. So, before we dive too far down the path, let's see who all has decided to come join us on the bridge. And Wendy, you have to leave the triples at home.
Oh, I can't bring my triples. Aw. Well, I guess I'm first up to do the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Van Camp. I'm a speculative poet, a science fiction author, and all-time Star Trek fan. And I'm really happy to be on this panel because I love geeking out about Star Trek.
Rachel.
Live long and prosper, my geek buddies. It is I, R Carr, otherwise known as Rachel to my friends, and Jim. And I am an author of science fiction, fantasy, and pretty much a Star Trek fan since birth. And my first memory is being traumatized by the Wrath of Khan in the theater. So this should be a fun and exciting podcast. And I have a book coming out, so I am totally pimping myself too.
Chris?
I'm Chris Cavett. I was a toddler when the original series aired. It was past my bedtime, but I remember getting up once for a glass of water or something when my parents were watching it and passing through the room when there was a transporter scene and just being transfixed by that. And then a few years later, when I was in elementary school, a local TV station started running the episodes after school every day. And then right after that, the animated series debuted, and I was hooked.
Adam?
So, hi, my name's Adam Gaffen. I'm a science fiction author. I specialize in near future hope punk sci-fi, which means I take a Star Wars scope with a Star Trek ethos. And I'll jump in with, I know it was going to be the first one that Chris already broached the subject. My introduction to Star Trek was actually the animated series and watching that, original run way back in the day. And then I got into reruns of the original series.
Bobby?
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I write all kinds of stuff. I'm not evil Bobby. The goatee is actually gone, so which is,
Bobby, I was going to say,
shaving.
we don't
It was
know what to do
not
with this.
done on purpose, but it just worked out that way. I write all kinds of stuff, novels, comics, et cetera, et cetera. I've written unofficial Star Trek. I read a couple of fan films that were produced. And oddly enough, coincidentally, just today, I was invited to write an essay for an upcoming Star Trek book about the original series. So that was pretty cool. My introduction was kind of like Chris was saying. It was after school. When I'd get home from school, have your little snack and all this, I'd watch Star Trek, and then my mother would be like, outside. And so I was hooked from that point on. So,
Jay?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Requard. I'm an author of epic fantasy and sword and sorcery. I'm also the host of the YouTube show Where No Blood Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast. I was really introduced to the show when I was 3, and my father let me stay up to watch Next Gen, and since then I've kind of watched everything. So, yeah.
And now I feel old.
Well, not as old as Jim. Like.
Yeah, I like this panel. I'm one of the young babies on it, so I'm enjoying this.
Jay, I can mute you.
Jay, I was watching when I was a toddler too, so I'm feeling kind of old. But we all love Star Trek, so that's okay.
David?
I'm David R. Slayton. I'm the author of the Adam Binder Urban Fantasy series and the upcoming epic fantasy Dark Moon Shallow Sea from Blackstone Publishing. And I grew up in Guthrie, Oklahoma, much like the main character in White Trash Warlock. in a trailer in the woods, and my mom was very religious and wouldn't let me watch anything with magic or superstition, but she had a soft spot for Star Trek, and we watched every night, 6 o'clock on Channel 34. Growing up in that trailer, I watched Star Trek every night. So I saw the original series just over and over. And yeah, that was my introduction to it and falling in love with it. And probably my biggest brag on Star Trek is that David Mack named a character after me in his last Star Trek novel. And that was pretty cool.
All right, Wendy, we're going to throw this at you too, since you and Rachel did not get a chance to announce where your first taste of the grand epic that would be called Star Trek came from.
Oh, yeah, I guess I just didn't do it in the introduction. I didn't realize we were going to do it that way.
We weren't, but none of y'all follow directions.
Guess not.
It's all Chris's fault.
I actually started watching from season 1. I was a very small child. I don't even know how old I was, but I remember sitting up with my dad, and he was also a sci-fi fan, and we would watch Star Trek together. My mom never liked it, so it was kind of something that my dad and I would do together. And I basically just kept living with Star Trek. I distinctly remember working for the cable station. I was one of those people that sit up in the head end, which is where all the broadcasting equipment is. I'd have to be there to press buttons to put the TV shows on. And I would have Star Trek on every night to keep me company. That was Next Gen. But I love Star Trek. I've been a fan all my life. And I'm looking forward to hopefully new Star Trek in the future.
And Rachel.
Well, I too had the watching Star Trek with my dad as a little geek girl in the 80s, and we would watch on the UHF station. They had reruns of the original Star Trek on Saturdays and the animated series in reruns. So I was very confused where Chekhov went, because I had a wee little bit of a crush on him when I was a small child, as well as Sulu and Uhura. But hey, we can't all be picky. And then my dad decided to take little 5-year-old R.E., not Carr at the time, but to the theater to see Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, because the first movie didn't have anything that would scare a child. And he knew I loved Star Trek. And my mom said, this is a bad idea. And for once, my mom was right. Because the second the earwig scene happened in the beginning, imagine teeny tiny 5-year-old R.E. Carr screaming. So naturally, my mom immediately took me to the next movie over, which was the far more family-friendly Bambi, right as his mom got killed. And I have been traumatized for life. I can watch The Wrath of Khan, but I cannot see Bambi because I forever associated with the earwigs and Chekhov. So that was my dramatic intro to Star Trek.
And
this is beautiful. This should be like a bit where they take you from one movie into the next, and each time it's just this whole sequence.
It's traumatizing.
That's right. You leave Bambi and go to Old Yeller.
Oh God!
Cinemax 20, right? It's just It
was like, you should have seen my parents. Like, I have meltdowns as an adult that are pretty bad, but imagine 5-year-old ADHD suffering Rachel with just I think I was too paralyzed with utter horror from watching a deer shot. It took me about 25 years to be able to eat venison, thanks to that movie.
So now that we've traumatized everyone, I got my start with Star Trek as a kid with it in reruns, but it was, where it came on the afternoon after school, the whole bit. And because I was not quite old enough to be a toddler running through in the original run, I look ancient and decrepit and high mileage. I've earned every bit of it. But
wow, Jay thought it. You said it. That's amazing.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you.
Don't worry, we'll dogpile for the rest of the evening.
All of you off my bridge, all right? So, Mrs. Carr, since we stopped there, I may as well pick back up there. Do you? And I know that this is a cruel question to ask, and I'm going to pose to everyone. But do you have a favorite series and a favorite character? And if you do, you have to give the favorite memory that sets that.
Oh my God, absolutely. I I think formative years going into elementary and high school, it was Next Generation every Sunday night in syndication. It's like the only time I remember watching a show with my family, and I instantly identified with Data. Of course, I know now I was a neurodivergent kid, and the feeling like you look human, but you're not quite was very resonant. And as soon as I saw the episode Data's Day and I realized he had a cat too, completely sold. That was the absolute moment that Data became my favorite character, and I followed him all throughout time, and thus I'm traumatized by Nemesis, like many a Trekkie or Trekker. I don't discriminate how you like to identify yourself, but I am definitely Data's bitch.
Well, we do know he is fully functional thanks to the first.
I'm not saying I ever wrote fan fiction. I'm not saying it.
So, Chris, can you please save Rachel before she says something?
My favorite series is Deep Space Nine. Came along, it was just a little bit darker. The people were a little more realistic. I love that Roddenberry had this vision of the future where we had gotten better, but we're not going to get that much better in a few hundred years. I think we have a lot of history that shows that's not true. And Deep Space Nine seemed more realistic to me. And I'm going to cheat. I'm going to name two favorite characters, Cisco and Dax. I just loved the relationship they had. And I guess my moment would be every time he called her old man, and understanding why he called her that. That was my favorite moment.
It was perfect. I am totally there with you. And it snuck in sort of a trans allegory before you could sneak in a trans allegory, and it was perfect.
Adam?
So I'm actually going to agree with Chris. Deep Space Nine was and is my favorite series. I particularly appreciated the fact that it had such a complex storyline that went for all 7 seasons. I mean, there was stuff that was referred to in the first episode that they finally put some closure to in the last episode. Mm-hmm. And that just made my little heart happy. And I'm actually going to say Garrick because it just, his sense of humor and you always knew he was up to something. And even when you thought you knew what he was up to, you knew that that wasn't all he was doing. And there was always another layer to him. So a wonderfully crafted, underappreciated character.
I always wanted a Garrick series.
Yeah, Andrew Robinson did such a wonderful job playing that part.
Bobby?
Yeah, I'm going to agree. Deep Space Nine is probably my favorite series of all the Treks. I love the fact that that it does show us characters with some more different sides to them. As much as I love the characters in the original series and TNG and even Voyager, they were almost all perfect, These were the guys that were in the Federation. They were in that perfect little society. When we would go to other planets, it always kind of bugged me that every planet they went to for the first time was still kind of this perfect society. And with Deep Space Nine, we kind of started to see that not all these other societies were quite so perfect. There's a great one-liner speech in there where Cisco is like, the problem is Earth. It is easy to be a saint in paradise. It is hard to be a saint out here. And I thought that really just summed up everything. Plus, it was one of those grand opportunities to see how the Federation fights a war. Because the 2 series that came before, there are multiple instances where they talk about the aftermath of this war we fought. They were always talking about, we were involved in this conflict, but we never saw those. So seeing how the Federation fought a war, I thought was very interesting. Favorite characters, I'm gonna cheat as well. I'm gonna give you 2. For the longest time, it was Bones. Bones is just the coolest guy. He gets the greatest lines. He's awesome. But I think if you look at over all of Star Trek, to me, Miles O'Brien is probably the coolest character ever.
He is the most important man in all of Starfleet, if you believe Lower Decks.
Yeah, and he was also the most relatable. He was the guy. Chief O'Brien reminds me of that. Remember the cartoon where the sheephound and the wolf go out and they're talking to each other like buddies. They clock in, then he chases him. I imagine that Miles is like that. He gets up, goes to work, clocks in. Okay, let's go save the universe. Gets through the day, clocks out, goes home. Hi, honey, and that's his day.
He was every man.
Yeah.
Yes. A union man.
Yes.
Union man.
Undoubtedly.
All right, Jay.
People are cheating and picking multiple characters. I honestly idolize and look up to Jean-Luc Picard. He's just one of those characters for me. But I really was drawn, and it's not my favorite series, but I really like how they wrote Jonathan Archer in terms of a captain who's out there without a federation, who's stuck on his ship by himself. He has no prime directive. They have none of the real technology that the series has come to rely upon in terms of major parts of its storytelling. And it was also very interesting to see Star Trek written in kind of a post 9/11 environment, and that character kind of be written around that. And just watching, I always look at Archer as kind of a pirate. My favorite series, I think everyone acknowledges that DS9 is the best series, but I really enjoy Lower Decks. I think Lower Decks takes everything about the Star Trek canon and not only makes fun of it, but does so lovingly and actually respects the storytelling that came beforehand. A lot of shows can do two different things with comedy. They can either affirm the story that they're telling with the jokes, or they can deconstruct them and throw all of that away. Lower Decks has kind of decided to take a middle path where it not only deconstructs the Star Trek universe, but it does so in a way that's loving, and it tries to give it a reason. And the characters themselves, are imperfect. They're in many ways the antithesis of what Roddenberry wanted. But they're also the embodiment of what he wanted to in terms of watching humans get better. And I think that show, more than any, especially with the new Trek, has really kind of nailed those themes. And I'm a really big Lower Decks fan. And my 3-year-old son loves it. We watch it every day.
David?
You're going to probably get a little cat. Sorry. This is a tough one because I love them all. And everybody's made such great points. A favorite character is almost impossible to nail down for me. I would probably have to go with Dax, just because, again, I thought that Terry Farrell just did such an amazing portrayal, and the layers that she brought to that character and the depth, and as they peeled back more and more. I could name 50 favorite characters and probably still keep going. My favorite series, though, is Discovery, and for lots of reasons, but I love it. It's a science ship. I love that the ship itself, the Crossfield class, is shaped like an IDIC symbol. I think that's really cool. I think they've taken some great big swings, especially the way they ended this recent season and the way that they do with aliens, the effects. And it also just has a special place in my heart because we were in such a, drought of Trek for so long. And I had just met my partner. We just moved in together, and I said, "Oh, there's this new Star Trek coming. Will you watch it with me?" And it's become our show, and it's become Discovery has then launched all this new Trek that we have watched as well, and now we're going back and watching old stuff together. And it also, Discovery, the toothbrush scene with Hugh and Stamets in the first season. This is a franchise I've loved my entire life again, and waited 40 years to see myself reflected in this franchise that had basically, neglected and erased us in so many ways. I was like, finally, that toothbrush scene is Discovery had my whole heart at that moment.
Wendy?
Well, I think like David, I have trouble picking favorites. They're like my family. Your children. How can you have a favorite one? I think I want to, I think my favorite series has to be TNG. I just love the full arc, the quality of the writing. The acting is just wonderful across the board. I admit they had a slow start, but once they hit their stride, it's what launched 1,000 ships. But I think lately I am growing to really love Ensign Mount, who plays Captain Christopher Pike on Strange New Worlds. I have fallen in love with this new Star Trek show. It feels like Trek, and yet it seems modern, but it seems to have that. It feels like Star Trek has finally returned to me, and that is what excites me. For a long time, the new stuff, and with all due respect to David, I couldn't get into Discovery. I finally, when Ensign Mount came on, I just watched it just to see his episodes. And then from that point, I just started watching, and I did watch it to the end, but only once. It's just not for me. But that's okay. I mean, there's something for everybody, and that's what it should be about. But I think with Strange New Worlds, I just love how it's very inclusive. I love that it has the old comedy elements. They did a episode where the doctor's story that he was reading to his daughter, Dr. Magenga, and he was the king of the castle and all that. So it wasn't the captain was always the boss. This was from the viewpoint of the ship's doctor. And it was fascinating to me how that came about and how they find a Bolson brain out there in the universe, which is just a pure speculative science fiction concept. But it was really nice to see it done, and done in a way that was relatable. But I like his character just because even though he's the captain and he is the leader, he still has a lot of relatable qualities, very down to earth. So I kudos to the actor, and I have great hopes for this new series.
And watching, DS9 was when it premiered, the night it showed. We were supposed to be going to a concert that night, and we were recording it and watching the Battle of Wolf 359. We actually made the people we were going out with wait while we could watch the first 10 minutes just to watch Battle of Wolf 359 at the beginning of that. And it was like, okay, we actually left the concert early to come back and rewatch the entire 2 hours, but we watched that segment of the battle, I don't know, 3 or 4 times that night. But Cisco was kind of, to me, nailed that perfect captain, because it was the imperfect leader but willing to do what it took on the frontier. I think if you took a Picard and you put him into that station, it would have failed miserably. I think you could have put a Kirk in there and you'd have had a brothel running out of quarks in a week. Oh wait, there was a brothel running out of quarks in a week. But
didn't Picard actually get luckier more often in the show than Kirk did? It's like like we always think of Kirk as the great womanizer, but man, and Riker got way more, and so did Picard.
Hey.
We could do a whole panel on the
Riker can't.
The whole Kirk himbo myth that is such a misunderstanding of Kirk, because he is so brilliant, like beating Spock at 3-dimensional chess. I hate the whole internet meme version of Kirk where he's just this womanizing himbo. That's so not Kirk if you watch TOS in depth.
We have Tom Paris to be a womanizing himbo, don't we?
Yeah. We've got our himbos.
But also, I mean, the Kirk thing too, one of the biggest things, if you ask people what Kirk is, is the rule breaking. And that really wasn't him in the original series either. That was the movies that kind of, because there are many episodes where is forced to do something because it's within the rules.
Right, and he's frustrated by it.
Yeah, he was leaving, in the Galileo 7. He's leaving. They're going to die. And it just happens to, that last minute save. But I've got my orders. I've got to do this. So, yeah, that Kirk is rule breaker kind of came later, but that has colored so many people's view of him. So when they did the reboots, he's that way as a teenager.
But he was also way younger, so it is, in effect, a different character. He had a completely different upbringing. It's one of the good reboots. I actually did enjoy the Kelvin timeline. Don't come at me too much.
No, I did too. So, in fact, I'm really hoping for another Chris Pine in movie.
I think he might be a tad bit too expensive. I think we have a Chris problem.
I don't know.
That's why I think we're now getting a Hemsworth problem.
Mhm.
But looking at all of this, I mean, part of the reason that we love it is obviously the characters. I mean, there's so many different series that are able to take this huge place of stories over hundreds of years. We get to see the good, the bad, the ugly. But, so it's about the characters, but it's also about all the different stories and allegories we got to see over all of these different series. One of the, going back to the original series, I was always a big fan of Harry Mudd because he was the lovable scamp, right? And, probably had a few more bodies buried in space, but he hadn't gotten caught on those yet.
Yeah, he's just selling people, no problem.
He's just selling people.
Intergalactic sex trafficker, that's all.
And tribbles.
But a lovable intergalactic sex trafficker. That's important in the 60s.
With a quality mustache.
That.
Are there particular episodes and kind of the allegories, the moral quandaries, the things that we saw sit with you guys that really also kind of cemented why the series is so important? So, Chris, I'll throw that one over to you. Jay, you just have to wait.
Can't believe I raised my hand like a student.
Yeah, may I pass?
Sure.
Just as you called on me, I was thinking, I hope he doesn't call me first. I need time to think about this one.
All right, Adam, I'm gonna make you go first.
So I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's a Deep Space Nine episode. It's basically Who Watches the Watchers. Yes,
Jay's nodding. The title is in Latin, which is why.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, everybody's got it now. But that one, it's so much it's the conflict between, okay, what is the greater good? Do I follow the rules and screw things up in the long term, or do I break the rules and, for the larger cause? And they go into it, but they don't go into it in a pedantic way. They don't go into it in a heavy-handed way. And you can tell that Sisko is absolutely shredded by this decision that he has to make. And that summed up the entire series, because it's all about the moral gray areas and the okay, what do we do now? When we're supposed to be doing this, but if we do this, it's going to screw us over. So yeah, that episode, and I'll look it up while somebody else answers theirs.
Bobby?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great moral quandaries through Star Trek. Certainly, City on the Edge of Forever. Kirk having to stand back and go against everything in his being, which is to save someone's life, to let them die on purpose, or in the Pale Moonlight, the Sisko, where Sisko is, I am guilty of killing someone, I am guilty of this and that, but it was one of those things. It's like, this is the most, I may have just ended the war earlier, I said, I can live with doing these bad things because it was for a good reason, but you can see how much it really weighs on him. So things like that, or, there's a great season 1 DS9 episode called Duet, where Kira is interrogating a Cardassian prisoner. And there is so much growth for the character of Kira over that one episode. But it is and it's two really good actors just back and forth with each other, almost like a really good stage play. And I think when you get those moments, and Star Trek's full of them, we could probably spend the whole thing talking about just really good moral episodes, or episodes with a point. But I think when Star Trek's at its best, it is really, around all the fun we have and the fights and all that, having these, really important allegories happen, I think is very important. And they do that well.
All right, Jay, I know you're busting.
Oh, God. I'm actually trying to look up the title of the episode. It's the one where they reprogrammed the EMH on Voyager, or the Doctor, to not remember the surgery he had to perform on Harry Kim, and the fact that he had to choose which Harry Kim or an ensign who had to live, essentially. I love that episode. I think it touches on so many things. First of all, like medical ethics, like when you're in a triage situation, how do you really choose who lives and who dies? And in this case, the Doctor's kind of wonders in the episode, did I choose Harry Kim because I like Harry Kim more? Or, he goes through all of these conundrums dealing with it. But then also the other one, and it's interesting because we're entering this period of artificial intelligence, and I think the Doctor and the EMH actually, if you look at that character, many of the questions that are asked around that character reflect some of the times we're in now. But I think the important one is, what happens if you have someone who really, and my wife is a former trauma nurse in the ORs, and she had this happen to her. What happens if you go through such a traumatic event that you can't get past it, like the EMH does in that episode? Yes, latent image. Thank you, Rachel. Latent image. That's the episode. What if you go through such a trauma in trying to save someone and it doesn't work out the way you want it to? How do you really go on? That is a real thing people go through in the medical profession, especially when they work in trauma. So gunshots, burn victims, everything you can imagine. How do you keep going when you might have done something to screw up and cost someone a life, even if it was something completely out of your hands? I think latent image really presses those buttons really well and deals with it very humanely. I mean, to the point where Janeway's literally sitting in the holodeck with the Doctor just as he stares off into nothingness, trying to figure out himself. And, the best way they try to deal with that is being humane to the program and giving it its time to work stuff out. And that's a very nuanced view of that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, and I think with Star Trek too, the fact that happened to the artificial intelligence, or something happens to Data or Worf or Spock, we see it from a different angle. If it had happened to Harry Kim, we'd be like, well, he's a human. We know how he should deal with that.
Yes.
We're able to look at it more objectively because it's not happening to one of the human characters.
Exactly. Very well put, Bobby.
I think Star Trek is often at its best when a non-human character is exploring humanity, when they're using that as a lens to ask, what does it mean to be human? And they do that so well. Every series has a character who's not quite human or is not human, and sometimes more than one, as in the case of Voyager. And they do such a beautiful job of always exploring that question. I think it's one of the most powerful devices that Trek has.
And I'm going to throw it back to Deep Space Nine. The episode was In the Pale Moonlight. But I'm going to throw it back to Deep Space Nine for just a second to build on David's point with the alien having the conflict between the two, because Kira is Sisko's second in command. Theoretically, they ought to be in lockstep to run this massive station. And at least for the first 2 seasons, they really aren't. They're at loggerheads pretty frequently because Kira just doesn't understand why they're doing it this way when that way is so much more effective. So that conflict, as opposed to the curiosity factor, comes out in Deep Space Nine.
Well, I think too they also had different goals.
Yeah,
Kira only was concerned with Bajor. That was it.
Yep.
Whereas Sisko had to think about the rest of the Federation, Bajor, what are the Cardassians doing? What's going on here? What's going and Kira could have cared less about any of that at the beginning.
Yeah.
It was just, I've got to protect my home.
So, Wendy, how about you? What's your moral quandary?
Well, what I liked, I think, about Star Trek in general is that it explored the issues of the time period when it was made. So the original series in the 1960s really hit a lot of the moral questions that we were asking in the 1960s. There was the Vietnam War going on. The women were just kind of coming into their rights. There was, just the fact that Uhura was on the bridge was a big deal back then. I know younger people may not realize that, but just the fact that she was there and spoke as an autonomous person, being a Black woman, was just, it was unheard of at the time and very groundbreaking. But Star Trek has been like that in every incarnation. In TNG, we talked a lot about the issues of the 80s, about corporations, about intelligence with machines, just everything under the sun. And it was done very well, very intelligently. And as time goes on, with the Discovery, we're exploring the issues of the day there as well. And I think it's really a great vehicle for that. One thing about Gene Roddenberry is he wanted to show a future that was positive. He wanted to show that science fiction does not have to be about destroying the world. It doesn't have to be war. It could be about a positive future. And his creation has inspired so much of our reality. It just boggles my mind when I think about it. Think of the cell phone. That came from Star Trek. Think of they're trying to develop a warp drive because a mathematician watched the warp drive on the Enterprise. He goes, "Can I do that?" "Oh yeah, maybe we can." And it's just, it inspires so much that has been so positive for our world. And I really hope we can continue having that positive attitude in Star Trek. I mean, yes, you do need conflicts for story, obviously, but I love the positive vibes that Roddenberry infused in all Star Treks. I mean, even in the Star Trek Enterprise, when it was more gritty and just going out the first time without all the technology, they still had this positive thing about humanity and going forward and working together. And I really, to me, that's what Star Trek is all about.
Rachel, since I've been making you sit in there, wait, and bounce for forever, I know.
Oh man, because I've built up so many. We've talked about in the Pale Moonlight, which is probably my favorite episode of all time in Trek. There's Far Beyond the Stars, which is the first real hardcore, yeah, we were racist in our past episode with Sisko, but we've talked a lot about Deep Space Nine. So I'm going to actually pull out a new Trek episode because I remember a huge discussion, and that is the Strange New Worlds episode, Lift Us Where Suffering Cannot Reach, which is basically their retelling of the Ursula K. Le Guin story, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, where you have a perfect society. But the reason the society can be so perfect and so advanced requires the suffering of a child, known as the first servant. And these people genuinely believe they're in the right because they know only one has to suffer, and everyone acknowledges it. And you really see a lot of Captain Pike because the first thing he tries to do is save the child. Even when he's been knocked out and dragged away, he immediately goes back for it and then realizes that there is no way to save him. And he's being asked, well, does nobody ever suffer in your Federation? And it makes you think, every time you pick up a cell phone, how many people, how much child labor went into this? But you don't look at it. And I know that my husband and I talked for about 2 hours after this episode, and it showed that yes, new Trek sometimes gets a rap, but this was a very classic Star Trek episode. And it took all my willpower not to use Through the Valley of Shadows from Discovery. So if anyone wants to talk about that one too, where Captain Pike has to face his fate, that's another good one.
All right, Chris. I'm
Well,
going to make you
I'm not
wait,
sure
Jay.
this is exactly a moral dilemma, but it's a good moral lesson is the devil in the dark. 'Cause it would have been so easy to just go along with, oh, this creature that's so big and scary and different from us is the monster, and these miners are right to want to hunt it and kill it. But the Enterprise crew realized that the miners were like the main character in I Am Legend, that they were really the monsters, and the Horta was protective mother, and they did the right thing. And then we learned a lot about not making assumptions, and that the right person or being, or the good being, could be the one that's different from us, not the ones who are like us.
All right, Jay, I think you had one more you wanted to throw in there.
So this is the one that always kind of keeps me coming back and looking at my own morals. I think it's a really tough episode. It's Star Trek Enterprise. I think it's season 3. It might be season 4, the last season. Similitude, where essentially Chief Engineer Trip Tucker is injured, and they basically have to clone his body, and basically raise his clone to the point that he's injured so they can kill the clone, extract his organs, and save Tucker. But during all of this, they have to actually raise the child, feed the child, take care of the child, love the child as he's growing up, into a full adult who somehow has Trip's memories too. And I think it's one of these great episodes that kind of applies to the modern world now. As Rachel said, when you look at your cell phone, who's suffering for that? But more importantly, we're moving into a world. My father works in biomedical sciences and biomedical technology. We're going to be moving into a world where we have to ask the question, who suffers for some of our medical advances? Because some people are going to start, especially in some countries, start using human experimentation like this to try to solve diseases. And, well before we were having to deal with this issue, Star Trek kind of laid the groundwork to have a discussion about this on a real moral and ethical level. And the episode's beautiful because it doesn't say anyone's good or anyone's bad, but it just goes through acknowledging hey, this really sucks. And having to deal with this thing sometimes just really sucks. And there's no easy answer to it. I think that's a beautiful thing that Star Trek can do. Still give us a compelling narrative, a compelling episode, but also, I guess, affirm a certain reality that we still all have to deal with. It's the reality that Trek carries with it, I think, that also gives it such power sometimes.
Yeah. The characters of Sim, Lal, and Tuvix are all great examples of that type of storytelling where,
I think Tuvix is much more...
hard moral
I think Tuvix is a much more easier debate than people.
No, he deserved... I will die on this hill. Tuvix deserved to live. He was created. I'm sorry.
He died on that hill too, but...
Well, no, he died on the transporter pad. Remember, I am holding you to pedantic semantics tonight, Jim.
So, one of the things that I also, when I look at some of my favorite episodes, and I had to go back and look and see which season it was because I couldn't remember. In Next Gen, season 4, there was The Devil's Due, which was all about the representation of the devil running a nice big scam, right? But it fell back to that idea of belief and why do we believe what we believe, how those things all come playing together. And that's one of the other big themes we see a lot as we study different cultures, different groups. Justice for Tuvix. Yeah, I know. But when we look at a lot of the belief systems we see across cultures, across planets, across species, and how it often is how we as humans would view some of those other belief systems. Again, we're back into the allegory. One of the big things that we saw is one of the biggest conflicts is the idea of the Q. So, we've always had the big argument about the Q. Were a lot of the deity level forces in the original series really Q. I kind of like the idea. It gives a level of continuity. I sort of like playing with the idea. And then we balance that against what we find out to be, something that Q fear, which was the Borg. And we've seen that conflict used across multiple series. We've seen it being both the inspiration for technological advancement, medical advancement, a lot of things along these lines. But at the same time, we've also watched what that causes the Federation, that level of perfect we want to explore, we will defend ourselves, to actually move into, okay, we're going to go build the Defiant class and we're going to go build a warship again, right? So I'm going to start with you on this one, Bobby, because I know you have a specific love there. But, for you, when we look at either the Q or the Borg, because they've really mirrored both sides throughout a lot of the different series, are there particular ones and particular storylines you think that really highlighted important things about the Trek universe?
You talking about just in terms of like gods in general, or just Q and the Borg?
Just in general.
Well, I it's weird too when we look at religion across the Star Trek series. The humans are rarely shown being overly religious. We don't see them doing much, prayer or meditation, but we see the Bajorans do it all the time. We see the Klingons do it all the time. We see the Vulcans do it quite often. So it's one of those things that, again, it's like we're viewing it through the lens of our non-human characters. When you talk to a human character about their religion, they're like, well, I believe in something, but they don't go into specifics because it is a TV show here on Earth, which is populated by so many different types of religion that I'm sure the reason is they just don't want to offend anyone. So, but using the alien characters to study religion, I think, tells you a whole lot. Looking at the religions of the Bajorans, for example, their lives are ruled almost by their religious beliefs. That their religious beliefs kept them alive during the occupation. And there's certainly earthbound allegories to that faith has gotten people through very difficult times. So then when characters like that then suddenly find themselves standing in a room with Q, it's like, what the hell is that? It can easily throw their belief systems out of whack. And so seeing how those characters react to that, like in the original series where they meet Apollo, that really causes some of our characters to kind of question things, to go, wait, what is this? Who is, how is this a thing? And so, yeah, I think because using the alien characters, we can kind of shine that light on certain things about religion. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but there.
We'll go with it. Jay.
I think when you talk, in my past, I was a religious studies major, so I read a lot about religion up to this day. My dad and I have a debate about like Q and whether they meet kind of the criteria to be considered a quote unquote god. And Star Trek plays with a lot of interesting notions about the idea of godhood and what does it mean to be deified versus just being another organism in this vast universe, sometimes a multiverse, because we have to remember there are universes stacked up, including the mirror universe, places like that. I think, and Bobby highlighted it really well with DS9, like religion does play a huge part in many of these alien civilizations that we see depicted in the show. And it's interesting because humanity has kind of moved to this place I think Rachel mentioned Data's Day. There's a part in Data's Day where he's dictating to his personal log about what's going on, and he mentions that on that calendar there's multiple holidays, including Holi, which is a Hindu holiday being practiced still. And the fact that he's still observing it means that there are still people like holding some sort of value in these cultural practices. Maybe they're not religious anymore by the 24th century, but they're still cultural practices. I think it's really hard, though, because Star Trek takes, for example, let's take the example of Kahless, the Klingon kind of Christ figure, or the patriarchal figure of their society.
I'd go more Moses, but whichever one.
A little bit more Moses. I think that's fair. I think Moses is very fair. If you look at the Klingon Moses and everything he does in his canonical story, Star Trek kind of frames in a way that, okay, it's possible that Kahless talked to some dude before a windstorm outside a city, and then that dude got killed in the windstorm. That's obvious. But it's a typical religious story showing about the wisdom of, prudence. Now, things like, him and Lucara, stuff like that, they don't ever say that these things aren't possible. And we see Worf and Jadzia Dax fight off all these people all the time. And we see Star Trek characters in the holodecks fight off 20 people at once. And, somehow Jim Kirk hasn't broken his fingers yet with the Kirk maneuver. So, the show in itself kind of plays with its own quasi-religious themes. Kind of to put a point on all this, I think in some ways, especially DS9, we focus a lot on Sisko being the emissary and kind of being a Christ-like figure to the Bajorans, but my wife and I'm actually leading my wife through her first watch-through of DS9, and it's been great. But one thing I've been noticing in this watch-through, we don't look at, Worf as a quasi-religious figure, but in many ways, he is. And he's also kind of the Star Trek heroic fantasy character in a way. He has a sword, he goes on these quests, he's kind of deciding the fates of kings.
But he is not a merry man.
He's not a merry man. But, if you look at how it plays with religion, Star Trek always acknowledges that, the cultural basis of these faiths matter to these people. And they're not something that you can just easily dismiss, because as much as people have their own stories, the world building matters. And for most of us, especially in the modern world, religion does form a big cornerstone, if not, for a lot of people, a basis of their worldview, in a sense. And I think Star Trek has always been very smart in terms of, not disrespecting it, but at the same time having a critical eye to it. And I know I just said a lot, so please, everyone else, please respond.
David?
So I think it's really interesting because I always thought of Q as a more advanced civilization that does not have a prime directive. I've always thought of the Q not necessarily as a godlike being, but a race where I'm just going to go in and mess with these undeveloped cultures or these civilizations that I don't think deserve it. Flinging the Enterprise into the path of the Borg. So when we first meet the Borg, it's all Q's fault, and they're not supposed to be there. And Guinan says you weren't supposed to have to encounter them this early. You're not ready for this. And I've always just thought of Q in that context. So I've read a lot of the novelizations, of course. And I read the Star Trek motion picture novelization, and Roddenberry had some comments on religion. He didn't like it, for sure. I always think back to the TOS episode with the wedding and Balance of Terror. It's very interesting how that's and then how religion does float at the edge of Star Trek when it comes to humanity. And I love that about the Bajorans. I love that for Ensign Ro, that there was an argument here about what's appropriate when it comes to the place of religion on a uniform and the arguments that could be made for or against that. So it's again, this is what I love so much about Star Trek is you can just ask these questions and you can just tease out so much. I recently went back and rewatched The Drumhead, and it's just chilling. It's just chilling to see that in the context of our current political times. I think it was Wendy who said Star Trek you can see it reflecting the political things of when it was written. And how old is that episode now? And I don't think the drumhead could be more relevant right now in our political culture than 30 some odd years later.
Wendy?
Oh, I gotta say, Q is one of my favorite characters. I just love it whenever Delancey comes on. But I don't really view him as a negative force. I mean, I think I did it first when I saw him in TNG. And by the way, I think Tremaine is Q from the original. I don't know if it was ever verified, but I firmly believe he was a young Q who just was having too much fun. But
it wasn't a novel. It was verified in a novel.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, it's just such a natural concept. But I really, as time has gone on, I really feel that Q is maybe a benefactor of humanity. Yeah, he's kind of bloodied our nose a few times, but we've learned valuable lessons every time. And every time we have overcome the trouble and we've grown from it. And, like he says, the universe is not a safe place. And sometimes you got to play a little bit harder and learn a few things. So, in a way, I almost feel like he has selected his champion, which is Jean-Luc Picard. And I guess now he's moving on to the sun. But that's another story, I guess. But
Cisco broke his nose.
Yes, something like that. But
well, what's that? There's that one quote where like Data says that Q always looked at Picard like a pet, like he's a pet he's teaching.
A pet.
Yeah.
I don't think he views Picard that way. I mean, I don't think he views Picard as an equal, but I think it's more like a mentor and protege almost. I don't think Picard will never have that kind of power that the Q has, but it's like he's guiding him as if he's mentoring him along in certain ways.
Almost a patronage.
Yeah, something like that. But the thing about Q too is, even though he has godlike powers, and in maybe an earlier time period, we would have viewed him as a god. But this comes back to, I think it was Clark's statement, where any advanced civilization will appear as magic. And in Star Trek, they're advanced enough to realize that maybe they don't understand how Q does what he does, but it isn't magic. It's just a superior science. And the Q also had problems of their own. They had so much power. What did they do with it? They were all bored to death. And that was their crux. And I found that kind of fascinating too. And perhaps another reason for Q to torment Jean-Luc Picard is he's bored. Picard was a good foil for that, just to see what Picard could figure out. So it was really a fascinating character, and I must say I really enjoyed Q. But getting back to the religious thing, I don't know if any of you really thought about that, but Uhura was definitely a Christian. She often, most of her lines would bring up Christianity and say, the other characters would ask, like, why would they do that? So she goes, oh, it's the sun. He's the sun, the Christian, whatever. And, she would bring that up. And I did notice in Strange New Worlds, the latest Star Trek, Christopher Pike is a Christian, and he blatantly says so in one of the episodes. And a lot of his character arc comes from the Judeo-Christian background. Now, he's not blatant about it. He's still very much a modern person, and it's not in the forefront. But, if you're looking for it, you can see it. It is there. I mean, he doesn't have to wear a cross. You know it's there. And I found that kind of fascinating, just to work that back into the character, because, again, if you look back at the original Star Trek, those Christian values were very much a part of the first episodes of the first show, and it seems to be returning back almost as an homage. So Star Trek is very complex, and we love it.
Rachel?
Well, I mean, you guys have talked about the gods. I think I need to talk about the monsters. which is definitely the Borg side of the equation, because the Borg are such an interesting villain, because when they're first portrayed, they are an existential threat. They are an unreasonable, as in you cannot reason with them, because they are literally a pure collective that only exists to consume and advance itself, almost like the ultimate evolution of capitalism, corporate structure, where you all become one with the whole, and all you will do is enhance the great collective. And I thought it was very interesting that when they brought the Borg into a more modern context, that spoilers for season 3 of Picard, sorry, I will put that out here, tune away for a second if you don't want to, but they actually assimilate everyone who's under 25 through a genetic manipulation. And I thought it was very telling, almost like the homogenization of culture that people accuse social media of doing. And the Borg have always been that fear we have of becoming too interconnected, too dependent on each other, which, I mean, Star Trek did start as rugged Western individualism. And in a lot of ways, they represent that fear that we will somehow lose ourselves. And that's what makes them so terrifying, except on Voyager, which did its best to make them as not threatening as possible, except maybe Prodigy, which was even less threatening. But they were kids, and that's okay. But I love the thought of the Borg being that sort of anti-religion, but yet still almost a godlike force. And I'm kind of sad to see that, spoiler alert again, please, they're kind of gone. I mean, Janeway done bleeped them up. I won't use the one for the episode, but she definitely done fucked them up.
But again, this comes back to Star Trek being a reflection of the time period. This storyline in Picard 3 is very much on our minds today. All the young people doing one thing and the older generation doing another. I have to say, I love the fact that the old people kind of saved the day. You don't see that often in literature. And go old team, yes. But
yeah, never been so happy to see so many wrinkles. Was one of my favorite lines.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's been twice. That's been twice that Star Trek has really made being older kind of not a bad thing, because that's the whole point of Star Trek 2 was, because at the beginning of that, we're all too old for this, and at the end of it, they realize, we've still got something left to offer. And I think that's a message that I understand a lot more now than I did when I originally saw Star Trek 2.
Honestly, that is a very good message for today, because we are all living a lot longer, and our culture is going to be changing because of that. People are remaining viable into their 80s and 90s sometimes, more often than they certainly did in the past. And we have to learn to acknowledge that. And I think it's a wonderful thing to have older people as not so much just being those wise characters that the young people consult, but actually being able to get out there and do something still, and be viable, and have agency, and be active in the community. And I think for Picard 3, that really came home to me, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the series.
Because I think, with the exception, I think LeVar or Michael, one of them's all of them, the cast except for one is like over 70.
Yeah.
That's
Hang on, I'm processing that. Give me a minute.
Or
sorry.
I mean, Jerry Ryan's in her 50s. I would love to look like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, and think about it, I'm older than the original cast of the Enterprise were in Star Trek 2 when they were talking about how they were too old to do their jobs. And I'm older now than they were then.
Gallivanting around the galaxy is a game for the young.
Yeah.
May I mention something, though, that's kind of important to the storytelling of Star Trek? Unlike our society, which has a lot of ageist tendencies, Star Trek has always been very open and forward with the idea that, and part of this is because in the future they have an elongated lifespan, far exceeding our own. I think Bones is 178 on Encounter at Farpoint. He's almost 200 years old. Closer than not. But there's always been a value of experience and being able to just matter in the moment outside of age or gender or species or whatever sort of category you could put people in. Star Trek engenders the idea that everyone has value still and can still contribute in a way that matters to the greater good of intergalactic society. I mean, I think if anything, it sets an example of where we should be going in terms of how we treat our elders.
And Scotty got to go to the retirement home with a bottle of scotch. So, Chris, how about you? Thoughts?
Didn't have much to say about the Q. Rachel covered the things I was going to say about the Borg, the existential threat, and the threat to that's fine, and the threat to our individualism. But I have been thinking about something else while people were talking about religion in Star Trek, and it's how surprising it is to me that sometimes the Vulcans seem almost religious. There's the logic and the Vulcan Science Academy, and the first Vulcan we got to know was the science officer. And I think a lot of people in our society today think that religion and science are incompatible. But the Vulcans, we've seen what are essentially Vulcan monks, like in the Andorian incident, in that outpost that was hiding the illegal sensor array, and where Spock went to undergo Kolinar, and we've seen where they have rituals, like is it Amok Time, where they have the torches and the gong and their rituals, and these most logical scientific people we can conceive of essentially are religious too in their own way, and I find that fascinating.
Adam, looks like I think you maybe get the last word on this one.
So, just to build on Bobby's point about places where the old people save the day, the last episode of Next Generation, All Good Things. Where does everything happen? Most of the episode in the future. So, and Beverly has her own ship, and Riker has, Riker's an admiral, but they're still out there doing things. And I'm going to throw a slightly different take on it. The Q and the Borg, I can see them as extensions of the original series battle between emotion and logic, because the Q are emotion and impulse with no boundaries. They just do whatever the hell they want, whenever the hell they want to do it, for no reason whatsoever. But the Borg are all about logic. They do things, with a purpose. They do things to advance their, to advance their race, and they do it with a plan, and they're all together on it. It is the ultimate embodiment of logic overall. So that's kind of how I see those two. It's that extension of the battles between Spock and McCoy. Just writ large. I mean, writ huge. Writ on a galactic scale.
I'm going to throw one more out there, just kind of as an open call, because I sort of opened this door. And as much as we've talked about DS9 tonight, there's one of my favorite characters of all time that sort of straddled those lines, and that was Wynn.
And Louise Fletcher died last year, sadly.
Yeah.
She
did.
played that role so beautifully.
Rest in peace, Space Karen. Rest in peace.
Because as much as we think of her as a bad guy, there are a lot of times, if you look at, if the story was not called Star Trek Deep Space Nine, it was called Star Trek Bajor, she's the hero.
Mm-hmm.
She's doing a lot of stuff to save that planet. She just doesn't do them in ways that make her come off very well.
But
and
why does it matter? Because she's doing it for her people, not for her likability.
Right. And I think Louise Fletcher straddles that line very well, because there are episodes where you do root for Kai Wynn.
Yep.
And there are other ones where you're just like, nope, somebody needs to take care of her. So yeah.
The definition of the morally gray character.
Mm-hmm.
And
Deep Space Nine
it depends on what lens you look at her through.
Yeah, and Deep Space Nine is full of those. I mean, Gul Dukat is the exact same way. From one point of view, he's doing exactly what he needs to do for his people. Now, granted, he's killing a lot of other people to do it.
But it's good for Cardassia.
It's good for Cardassia, But there's a lot. I think Deep Space Nine probably has more of those morally gray characters than any of the other series. And in seeing those morally gray characters play off each other is always cool.
Okay.
Especially with Garrick. Garrick makes everything better in Deep Space Nine.
I'm still voting for a Garrick series. A young Garrick. I'd like to see the young Garrick. But anyway, I think it's about time to separate this saucer section. But before we do, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, if you've got that latest release to let everybody know about as well. So, Wendy, you're up first.
Oh, okay. Again, I'm Wendy Van Camp. I'm the Poet Laureate for the city of Anaheim, California. I just had my latest anthology drop about 2-3 weeks ago. It's called Eccentric Orbits 4. It is a volume of speculative poetry, which is science fiction and fantasy themed poems. And my poets come from all over the world. A lot of them are the top rated contemporary speculative poets out there. I highly recommend it. Of course, I'm biased, but that's okay. And you can find it on Amazon, anywhere where books are sold. My website is wendyvancamp.com. Just how my name is spelled on the screen here. And I do have a new newsletter that's going out once a month on the 1st. It's just the No Wasted Ink newsletter and Ramblecast. Yes, I am experimenting with podcasting. So my newsletter comes with a voice version if you're interested. And you can find it on nowastedink.substack.com. And that's it.
Mrs. Carr.
Well, I guess we're up to me. I am R.E. Carr, but you can find me online at www.racheleccarr.com because the other Rachel Carr wrote vegan cookbooks, and that's not me. I have a new release coming out in the next few weeks. That would be book 4 of the False Icon series, Deviant Dark Dryads. It's not exactly science fiction, but it does have a Star Trek reference, so you need to read it to find it. And if you want to find me on social media, you can find me as Total Recar. And if you get that handle, you understand all my writing.
Chris?
I'm Chris. I'm just the answer to which one of these things doesn't belong, because I'm not a writer. I'm just someone who knows Nancy Northcott, which is how I ended up here. But I do write, though, every 2 months for Interlac, the Legion of Superheroes, APA, or Amateur Press Alliance. I'm the central mailer. We talk about the Legion of Superheroes and other comic books and other popular culture, including Star Trek a fair amount of the time. You can find us in our Facebook group, which is named Interlac, the Legion of Superheroes, APA Facebook group.
Adam?
So I'm Adam. You can find me at CassidyChronicles.com. Like I said, I write near future hope punk science fiction. And the reason I do that is the main character, Kendra Cassidy, grew up watching Star Trek. So she wants to make her world as close to Star Trek as she possibly can, which is a lot of fun because the world doesn't really want to go there. So there's a new collection of stories in the Cassidyverse coming out. That's The Heart of Space. It's going to be out in June, and it's a great place to start because they're all independent stories. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Just look for Adam Gaffen. I'm the only Adam Gaffen on there. And as Jim knows, I'm at a bunch of cons, and I'll see you at one of them.
Bobby?
I'm Bobby Nash. You can find me at bobbynash.com. That's the link to everything's on there. But I'm on Facebook at author Bobby Nash. I'm Bobby Nash on Twitter, and I'm Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram. So I'm not hard to find. Unfortunately I'm not the only Bobby Nash, but I'm not hard to find.
David?
You can find me at davidslayton.com. Just don't forget the R. There's a lot of David Slaytons out there, including some Florida man types. So don't forget the R. The Adam Binder books, the first one's White Trash Warlock. Those are the 3 of them are available now anywhere. Dark Moon Shallow Sea is out on Halloween, which is absolutely perfect for this book. But if you're looking for something of mine that has a lot of Star Trek references and a lot of geek references, I actually have a gay, geeky rom-com coming out next month called To Catch a Geek. And that will be with Crazy Maple Studios on their Kiss app. And then it should go to print. They do like the app for a while and then they do print like a year later. But you can find that in June. And To Catch a Geek by David R. Slayton.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host tonight, Jim Nettles, and you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, speculativefictionacademy.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here at ConTinual. I probably missed something in and amidst all the various projects there, but it's not hard to find me. Thanks again, and we will see all of you soon. We got to beam out of here.